Let me show you something worth noticing. There's a moment that happens quietly, usually on a Sunday evening or during a long drive, when you realize you've been making the same decision for years without ever really deciding. It's not dramatic. There's no crisis. You're just sitting there, and you notice that the life you're living wasn't chosen so much as it was accepted. And the strangest part is how reasonable it all seemed at every single step. You took the job that paid well enough, in the city that made sense, doing work that wasn't terrible. You stayed because leaving felt complicated, because the benefits were good, because you told yourself you'd figure out what you really wanted later. And then later became years. Not bad years necessarily, just years that somehow passed while you were waiting for clarity that never quite arrived. What makes this so hard to see is that comfortable decisions don't announce themselves as compromises. They feel like pragmatism. They feel like being responsible. When you choose the path that doesn't require you to defend yourself at dinner parties, when you take the option that your parents understand, when you accept the offer that lets you stop worrying about money for a while, it genuinely seems like you're being smart. And maybe you are. But there's something else happening too. Something that only becomes visible much later. Time has a way of amplifying whatever direction you're pointed in. Not through dramatic events, but through the simple mathematics of repetition. If you spend your days doing work, that's fine. If you invest your energy into relationships that are comfortable but not quite alive. If you organize your life around not making mistakes rather than around something you actually want, time doesn't punish you with a single catastrophic failure. It punishes you by making that direction permanent, by turning a temporary compromise into the shape of your entire existence. The people who feel this most acutely are usually the ones who did everything right, according to the conventional script. They studied what they were supposed to study, pursued careers that sounded impressive, made financial choices that seemed obviously correct. And then one day, they're 47 or 53 or 61, and they realize they've built a life that's entirely defensible and almost completely detached from anything they actually care about. Not because they made bad decisions, but because they made safe ones over and over until safety itself became a kind of cage. Here's what nobody tells you about comfortable decisions. They're not free. They have a price, but it's denominated in years, not dollars. When you choose the path that doesn't scare you, when you take the option that lets you avoid difficult conversations or uncomfortable uncertainty, you're not avoiding cost. You're just deferring it. And the bill comes due much later, in the form of a life that belongs more to your younger self's anxieties than to anything you would choose now. There's a particular kind of regret that comes from this. It's not the regret of having tried something and failed. That kind of regret is actually pretty easy to make peace with, because at least you know what happened. You took a shot, it didn't work, you have a story. The regret of comfortable decisions is harder to process because there's no clear moment where things went wrong. You were just being reasonable year after year, and somehow that reasonableness calcified into a life you don't quite recognize. What makes this so insidious is that comfortable decisions protect you from immediate feedback. If you quit your job to start a company, you'll know pretty quickly whether it's working. If you move to a new city for no reason other than curiosity, you'll find out fast whether that was a good idea. But if you stay in a situation that's fine, if you accept a life that's comfortable enough that you can't quite justify leaving, you can go years, even decades, without any signal that you've made a mistake. Because you haven't made a mistake exactly. You've just traded long-term aliveness for short-term peace of mind. And that trade is invisible until suddenly it isn't. The shift happens when you start noticing people who made different choices, not reckless choices, but uncomfortable ones. The person who left the corporate job to do something weird. The couple who moved somewhere nobody expected them to move. The friend who walked away from a prestigious opportunity because it didn't feel right, even though they couldn't articulate why. And what you notice isn't that their lives are perfect. They're not. But there's a quality of ownership in how they talk about their decisions, even the ones that didn't work out. They're living in the consequences of choices they actually made rather than choices they drifted into. This is where the psychological mechanism reveals itself. Comfortable decisions don't just shape your external circumstances, they shape your internal sense of agency. Every time you choose the path that doesn't require courage, you're training yourself to believe that courage isn't available to you. Every time you defer a difficult decision because it's easier to wait, you're practicing the art of waiting. And over time, that practice becomes identity. You become someone who doesn't make waves, who doesn't rock the boat, who doesn't take chances, not because you can't, but because you've spent years rehearsing caution till it feels like personality. The cruelty is that this process is almost invisible while it's happening. When you're 28 and you take the safe job, it feels like one decision. When you're 33 and you stay in the safe job, it feels like continuity. When you're 41 and you realize you've spent over a decade building someone else's dream instead of figuring out your own, it feels like waking up in someone else's life. But it wasn't one mistake. It was 1,000 small choices to prioritize comfort over curiosity, security over aliveness, other people's expectations over your own barely articulated sense of what might be worth trying. There's a concept from psychology called the region beta paradox, though the name doesn't matter as much as the observation. It describes a situation where being in a moderately bad state can actually be worse than being in a terrible state, because the terrible state forces you to change while the moderately bad state lets you stay stuck. If you're in a job that's actively making you miserable, you'll eventually quit. But if you're in a job that's just okay, that pays well enough and doesn't demand too much, you can stay there indefinitely. You're not happy, but you're not unhappy enough to do anything about it, and years pass. This is the shape of how time punishes comfortable decisions, not through dramatic failure, but through the slow accumulation of days that don't quite matter, through the gradual realization that you've spent your one wild and precious life, as the poet said, being reasonable, that you've optimized for not being wrong instead of for being alive, that you've built a life that looks good from the outside and feels like a waiting room from the inside. The people who seem to avoid this trap aren't necessarily braver or smarter. They've just developed a different relationship with discomfort. They've learned, somehow, that the feeling of being scared about a decision is information, not a warning. That uncertainty isn't something to avoid, but something to move toward, carefully, because that's where the actual texture of life is. They understand that the cost of a mistake you make is almost always smaller than the cost of a mistake you let happen to you by not deciding at all. But here's what doesn't help: beating yourself up about past choices. If you're recognizing yourself in this, if you're sitting with the uncomfortable awareness that you've been making comfortable decisions for years, self-criticism isn't the move. Those decisions made sense at the time. You were working with the information and the courage you had available. The question isn't whether you should have known better. The question is what you do now with the awareness you have now. And that question doesn't have a clean answer because life isn't a problem to be solved. You don't undo years of comfortable decisions with one dramatic gesture. You don't quit your job tomorrow and move to Portugal and solve everything. What you might do, though, is start paying attention to the moments when you feel the pull of the comfortable choice and the pull of the uncomfortable choice at the same time. Start noticing which one you reflexively move toward and what that reflex is protecting you from. Because the real insight here isn't that comfortable decisions are bad. It's that comfort and safety and reasonableness are not the same as rightness. They're not even the same as wisdom. Sometimes the smart thing is to stay put. Sometimes the smart thing is to wait. But sometimes the smart thing is to do something that makes no sense to anyone else, that you can't quite defend, that scares you a little, because the alternative is spending the next decade practicing a life that doesn't belong to you. Time is going to pass either way. The question is whether it's passing while you're building something that matters to you or while you're managing something that matters to someone else. Whether you're learning what you're capable of or learning how to be comfortable with less than that. Whether you're making choices or letting them make you. There's no formula for this. No 5 steps to stop making comfortable decisions. Just the quiet, ongoing practice of noticing when you're choosing peace over aliveness and asking yourself what that choice costs in the only currency that actually matters, which is years, and then sometimes making a different choice. Not because it's guaranteed to work out, but because not making it is guaranteed to leave you wondering. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's next.